The unspoken truth. The courtroom was quiet, an eerie silence that seemed to swallow every sound. It was as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to break the tension in the air. The morning sunlight filtered through the high windows, casting long, jagged shadows across the rows of wooden pews where spectators sat, each one with their eyes fixated on the small, timid figure at the defendant's table. Jaden, a young black boy no older than 12, sat hunched in a chair far too large for him, his thin frame almost swallowed by the oversized wood. His faded hoodie, too big for his small body, hung loosely around his shoulders, and his jeans, frayed at the cuffs, pulled around his sneakers. Despite his apparent youth, the weight of the moment pressed heavily on him, his small hands trembling as they clutched the edge of the table. He looked out at the people in the room, their eyes full of judgment and curiosity, but he didn't look back at them. Instead, his gaze was fixed on one person only, the woman sitting at the front of the room, in the high seat of authority, the judge. Judge Rebecca Hart, a woman in her late 40s, sat at the bench with a steely expression that suggested she was both in control and unmoved by the emotions that swirled around the room. She had a reputation for being tough, a judge who didn't tolerate nonsense, especially when it came to juvenile offenders. Her face, sharp and angular, betrayed nothing as she flipped through the thick case file in front of her, seemingly uninterested in the weight of the case. The case at hand had drawn the attention of local media, and it wasn't hard to understand why. Jaden, a boy from a poor neighborhood, had been accused of trespassing in a wealthy, gated community. He had been found on private property late at night, his actions suspicious enough to prompt a phone call to the police. The homeowner who had called the authorities claimed that Jaden had been loitering near a mansion, and when questioned, he had been uncooperative, refusing to answer questions or provide an explanation for his presence. The prosecutor was already speaking, outlining the charges in a manner that made Jaden seem like little more than a statistic, a product of a troubled upbringing, a face in a system that had long since given up on kids like him. The words washed over Jaden, each one cutting deeper than the last, until he felt numb to the accusations, as though they weren't even directed at him. But there was something else he couldn't shake, a feeling, an undeniable pull towards the woman at the bench. Rebecca Hart wasn't just a judge to Jaden. There was something about her face, something about the way she carried herself, that tugged at his memory. It wasn't a feeling he had been able to make sense of before, not until this very moment. And so, as the prosecutor continued to speak, recounting the details of the case, Jaden's gaze remained fixed on the judge. His heart pounded in his chest, and his breathing grew shallow. It was as though something inside him was waking up, forcing him to confront a truth that had been buried for years. Suddenly, the words coming from the prosecutor's mouth faded into the background. Jaden's focus was entirely on Judge Hart. He studied her face, the sharpness of her features, the coolness of her demeanor. But beneath the mask of professionalism, there was something more, something he couldn't place, but he knew it was there. His heart began to race as the recognition surged through him. The sensation was undeniable, and before he even knew what he was doing, Jaden stood up. The courtroom went silent, every head turning to look at him. The prosecutor paused mid-sentence, eyes widening in confusion. The judge, who had been scanning her notes, glanced up. "Defendant," she said, her voice stern, "is there something you wish to add?" Jaden's hands were trembling now, his palms slick with sweat. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The weight of the room, the eyes of so many people on him, was almost too much to bear. He swallowed hard, trying to find his voice. Then, finally, it came out, his words barely more than a whisper. "I know you," he said, his voice shaking with the force of his own emotions. "You're my mom." The courtroom erupted in gasps. Some people turned to their neighbors, exchanging whispers of disbelief. Even the prosecutor seemed frozen in place, a look of shock on his face. Jaden's heart hammered in his chest as his gaze remained locked with the judge's. The woman at the front of the room blinked, her pen hovering above her notepad. I beg your pardon." Judge Hart's voice was almost too soft, and for the first time, Jaden saw something flicker in her eyes. Something unfamiliar. Jaden's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him, but there was only one person he cared about now. "You're my mom," he repeated, his voice cracking with the intensity of his emotions. "You gave me up when I was a baby. My foster mom told me everything." The courtroom fell completely silent. The words hung in the air, heavy and charged with an energy that made the walls feel like they were closing in. Rebecca Hart's expression was unreadable, but the color drained from her face. She stood frozen at the bench, her gaze locked on Jaden, as though she were trying to understand the puzzle that he had just presented her with. The whispers from the audience started to swell, but Rebecca's attention was entirely focused on Jaden now. Her breath hitched, her heart racing as his words reverberated in her mind. The truth that had been buried for so long was clawing its way to the surface, and she didn't know how to stop it. She had spent her life building a fortress around her past, a past she thought she had put behind her. But now, standing before her, was the child she had left behind, the child she had never been able to forget. Jaden's voice cracked again as he spoke, his words raw and filled with a pain that far exceeded his years. "I remember your face. My foster mom showed me a picture of you. She said you were scared, that you wanted me to have a better life. But why didn't you come back for me? Why didn't you even try?" Each word struck like a dagger in Rebecca's chest, and for the first time in years, the walls she had so carefully constructed began to crumble. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The truth was far more painful than she had ever imagined. "I don't know what you're talking about," she finally managed to say, her voice trembling as she looked down at her hands. The walls were closing in around her, and she could feel the weight of the moment crushing her from all sides. The courtroom buzzed with a mixture of disbelief and curiosity, but none of that mattered to Jaden anymore. His dream of seeing the woman who had once been his mother had been dashed in an instant. The coldness in her eyes, the denial in her voice, were enough to shatter everything he had ever hoped for. Before Rebecca could gather her thoughts, she stood abruptly, the screech of her chair scraping against the floor like a harsh cry that echoed through the room. "We will take a short recess," she said, her voice trained, before she fled from the courtroom, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. The room was left in a stunned silence, and Jaden collapsed back into his chair, his body shaking with the intensity of the emotions that had just been unleashed. The courtroom was no longer a place of justice. It was a place of raw pain, a place where the truth had been dragged into the light in a way that no one could have anticipated. As the murmurs of the crowd filled the space, Gloria Adams, the social worker who had once facilitated Jaden's adoption, stepped forward and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "It's okay, Jaden," she whispered. "You've been brave enough already." But Jaden could hardly hear her. The only thing that mattered now was the unanswered question that lingered in the air. Why had Rebecca Hart, the woman he had dreamed of finding, walked away from him again? The answer was somewhere in the truth, a truth that had been buried for far too long. And in that moment, Jaden knew that he wasn't done searching. The unraveling. Rebecca Hart's retreat from the courtroom felt like a tidal wave crashing through her carefully constructed life, pulling everything she had worked for into a suffocating undertow. Each step she took toward her chambers felt heavier than the last, as though the air around her had thickened, making her movements slow and deliberate. The sound of her heels clicking against the polished courtroom floor echoed in her ears, each step marking the distance between the truth and the life she had spent decades building. Inside her chambers, Rebecca felt the walls close in on her, not from the physical space around her, but from the weight of the revelation that had just shattered her world. The truth had a way of creeping in, quiet, insistent, and unrelenting. And now, with Jaden's words still ringing in her mind, she couldn't outrun it any longer. She slammed the door behind her, the action sharp and final. She leaned against it for a moment, her breath coming in shallow bursts as she tried to ground herself in the here and now. Her fingers trembled as they reached for her desk, her mind racing with memories she had spent years burying. The photo of Jaden, the one she had kept hidden deep in her drawer, was still fresh in her mind's eye. The moment she had signed the adoption papers, handing over her baby to strangers, had been one of the most excruciating decisions of her life. The pressure from her parents had been overwhelming. They had told her she was too young, too scared to be a mother. They had convinced her that her future would be ruined if she kept the child, that the best thing for him would be to give him away. The shame of that day had haunted her for years. She had convinced herself it was the right thing to do, that the life she had created for herself as Judge Rebecca Hart, the powerful, in-control figure sitting at the head of a courtroom, was worth the sacrifice. But now, in the quiet of her chambers, the truth felt like a weight she could no longer carry. Rebecca closed her eyes, trying to steady her breath. The thought of Jaden, sitting in that courtroom with tears streaming down his face, haunted her. He had looked so much like the child she had once held in her arms, the child she had kissed goodbye all those years ago. She had tried so hard to push those memories away, to tell herself that she had done the right thing. But now, with Jaden standing before her and calling her his mother, those walls she had built around her heart began to crack. The quiet knock on the door pulled her out of her thoughts. She straightened up, wiping a hand over her face as she tried to regain her composure. "Come in," she called out, her voice hoarse. Gloria Adams entered the room, her presence immediately filling the space with a calming energy. She had been a constant in Jaden's life, his social worker, his advocate, and the one who had always believed in him, even when the system had let him down. Gloria's eyes were filled with understanding as she closed the door behind her and took a seat across from Rebecca's desk. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think we both know that this isn't just about Jaden's case anymore," Gloria said, her voice gentle but firm. Rebecca didn't respond right away. Instead, she gazed out the window, her thoughts swirling as she tried to make sense of the mesh she had found herself in. She had spent so many years protecting herself from the past, from the decision she had made as a frightened teenager, and now it felt like that past was coming back to destroy everything she had worked for. "I never expected this," Rebecca said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I had buried that part of my life. I thought I had moved on. But seeing him there, hearing him call me his mother, it's like everything I've done has been a lie." Gloria's gaze softened, and she leaned forward, her voice steady and reassuring. "You were just a kid, Rebecca. You were scared, and you did what you thought was best at the time. But Jaden's been through so much. He's carried that pain for years, wondering why you never came back for him. It's not about blame. It's about healing." Rebecca's chest tightened at the words. She had spent so much of her life convincing herself that she had done the right thing, that she had made the best choice for Jaden. But now, as the truth slowly began to seep into her consciousness, she wasn't so sure anymore. Jaden's pain was real. His yearning for answers, for connection, was palpable in every word he spoke, and she had been the one who abandoned him. "Do you think he'll ever forgive me?" Rebecca asked, her voice fragile. Gloria sat back in her chair, considering the question for a moment before answering. "I don't know, Rebecca, but I do know that forgiveness isn't something you can demand. It's something you earn. And right now, Jaden needs you to face the truth. He's been searching for you for a long time, and now that he's found you, he needs you to show up for him, to acknowledge the hurt, the abandonment, and the fact that you're the one person who can offer him answers." Rebecca felt the weight of Gloria's words press down on her chest. She had spent so many years hiding from the past, trying to outrun it. But now, there was nowhere left to hide. She had to face Jaden, not as the judge, not as the woman who had built a life based on authority and control, but as the woman who had made a mistake that had cost a child his sense of belonging. "Do you think I can do that?" Rebecca asked quietly. Gloria's smile was gentle, but there was a strength in it that Rebecca couldn't ignore. "I think you can, but only if you're willing to confront your own fears and allow yourself to be vulnerable. You can't fix the past, but you can make a choice now. You can choose to be the person Jaden needs you to be." Rebecca stared at her hands for a moment, contemplating Gloria's words. She had never allowed herself the luxury of vulnerability. She had always been the strong one, the unshakable figure in the courtroom. But the truth was, she had been running from her own weaknesses, from the fear of being judged, of being seen as imperfect. And now, that fear was threatening to tear everything apart. With a shaky breath, Rebecca stood up and walked to the window, gazing out at the city below. She could hear the murmur of the courtroom in the distance, the voices of the reporters, the whispers of the spectators. But beyond that noise, she could hear Jaden's voice in her mind, calling her his mother. The words echoed in her ears, a reminder of the child she had left behind. For the first time in a long while, Rebecca felt a crack in her armor. The years of control, of power, of distance, all of it seemed meaningless in that moment. There was only one thing that mattered now, the boy she had once given up, the boy who had just revealed the truth to the world. She turned back to Gloria, her face pale but determined. "I need to go back out there. I need to face him. It's the only way." Gloria nodded, a look of approval crossing her face. "I'm proud of you, Rebecca." Rebecca took a deep breath and walked back to the door, her heart pounding with the fear of what she might find when she returned to the courtroom. But she knew one thing for sure. She could no longer hide from the truth. It was time to face the past, to meet Jaden where he was, and to give him the answers he had been waiting for. As she opened the door and stepped back into the courtroom, she could feel the weight of the eyes on her, the expectation, the judgment. But this time, she didn't flinch. She walked to the bench with a new resolve, ready to confront the truth, whatever it may be. The room fell silent as she took her seat, and Jaden's tear-streaked face met hers across the room. There was no going back now. There was only forward. And she knew that this moment, this painful, raw, real moment, would change everything. "Jaden," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence. "We need to talk." The reckoning. The moment Rebecca took her seat behind the bench, the room seemed to hold its breath. The heavy air in the courtroom was thick with the expectation of something monumental about to unfold. But for Rebecca, every inch of her body felt like it was carrying a weight far heavier than the gavel she had wielded for years. Her hands, usually steady and poised, now trembled as they gripped the edge of the desk. The eyes of the room, every curious, judgmental, and hopeful eye, were fixed on her. Jaden sat at the defendant's table, his small frame slumped as he stared at her with a mixture of anticipation and weariness. His once bright eyes now held the weight of a lifetime of questions. He had hoped for answers, but the answers were elusive, shrouded in mystery, and the pain of a history that had been kept from him. For the first time in years, Rebecca felt that familiar, raw vulnerability wash over her. It wasn't the vulnerability of a young woman scared and overwhelmed by an unexpected pregnancy. It was the vulnerability of a mother, a woman who had given up her child, now face to face with that very child. A child who had grown up to become a stranger, but who still carried the seed of recognition in his heart. Her heart ached as she looked at Jaden, his tear-streaked face staring back at her. She could see the young boy in him, but she could also see the man he would become, the one who had carried a lifetime of grief and confusion in search of someone who had never come for him. And here he was, sitting before her, waiting for the truth, a truth she hadn't been brave enough to face until now. The silence stretched between them, as if the room itself was holding its breath in the anticipation of what was about to be said. Rebecca opened her mouth, but the words felt too heavy to speak, too raw to utter. She cleared her throat, trying to find her voice in the stillness. I don't know where to begin," she said, her voice thin and trembling as she looked down at her hands. She could feel the heat of the room pressing in on her, but this time, It wasn't the weight of judgment from others that troubled her. It was the weight of the truth and the realization that she could no longer hide from it. "You don't have to say anything if you're not ready." Jaden's voice cut through the silence, his words shaky but surprisingly strong. "I just need to know the truth. Why did you leave me? Why didn't you come back?" The question hung in the air, raw and unrelenting. Jaden's gaze never wavered, and Rebecca felt as though he was peering directly into the deepest corners of her soul, forcing her to confront the ghosts she had buried long ago. Her eyes welled with tears, and for a moment her strength faltered. She had spent so many years convincing herself that the decision to give him up was the right one, that she had done what was best for him. But as Jaden's voice trembled with raw emotion, the lie she had told herself began to crack. "I was scared," Rebecca whispered, her voice hoarse. She looked up at Jaden, her eyes searching for any sign that he could understand. "I was only 18, and my parents told me I wasn't ready. They said I would ruin my life, and I listened to them. I thought it would be better for you, for your future, to have a family who could provide for you, who could give you what I couldn't." Jaden shook his head, his lips pressed into a thin line. He was no longer crying, but the pain in his eyes was more than Rebecca could bear. She had never imagined the toll her decision would take on him. The years of uncertainty, the years of longing for someone that would never return. "I didn't want to leave you," she continued, her voice faltering. "I couldn't keep you, and I thought it was the best thing for both of us. But it was a lie I've lived with every day since." Jaden sat there, silent, his hands clenched into fists on the table. He didn't say anything right away, and Rebecca feared she had lost him. She had expected anger, she had expected rejection, but the silence that followed felt even worse than anything she had anticipated. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Jaden spoke, his voice soft but resolute. "Why didn't you ever come back for me?" Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. She had never allowed herself to think about that, never allowed herself to consider what it would have been like if she had tried. To come back would have meant confronting everything she had buried, the shame of being a young girl who hadn't been strong enough to face motherhood. It would have meant confronting the truth that she had abandoned him, and that truth was a burden too heavy for her to carry. "I tried to forget," Rebecca said, her voice breaking. "I told myself it was for the best, that I had made the right choice. But every day, every year, I thought about you. I wondered where you were, what kind of life you had. I convinced myself that if I didn't look for you, if I didn't try to find you, it would make the pain easier to bear. But it never was." Jaden's eyes softened, and for the first time, Rebecca saw a flicker of understanding in them. He had been angry, yes, but there was something more now, a kind of sorrow that mirrored her own. He had lived with the lie that she had chosen to abandon him, and in doing so, he had carried that weight for years, just as she had. And now, they were both confronting it together. "You didn't have to do that," Jaden said quietly. "You didn't have to live with the lie. I needed you. I needed to know you cared. I needed to know you loved me." His voice broke, and his shoulders shook with emotion. "I'm not asking for you to be perfect. I just need to know why. I need to understand." Rebecca's heart shattered at his words. She had failed him in ways she could never undo, but she could finally, after all these years, offer him the one thing that had been missing: the truth. "I love you, Jaden," Rebecca said, her voice shaking. She stood up from behind the bench, her steps uncertain as she approached him. "I always have. I never stopped loving you." Jaden's eyes widened, and for a moment, the anger in his gaze flickered. He blinked rapidly, as if trying to process what he had just heard. But the truth was too overwhelming to comprehend all at once. Rebecca knelt down in front of him, her knees trembling beneath her. She placed a hand on his shoulder, the touch tentative but filled with the weight of everything she had never said. "I am so sorry for what I did to you," she whispered. I am so sorry for abandoning you, for not being there when you needed me. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I want you to know that I am here now. I want to be here for you, Jaden. I want to be the mother you deserve." Jaden didn't speak at first, but his body trembled as he fought back his tears. Rebecca could feel his walls crumbling as he slowly began to accept the truth. It was painful, and it was raw, but it was also healing. She had finally told him what he had needed to hear for so long. The silence in the room was no longer charged with the tension of unanswered questions. It was filled with the soft, almost imperceptible sounds of healing. The quiet acknowledgement that the past could never be undone, but that the future still held promise. For both of them. And so, as the room slowly began to shift back into its ordinary rhythm, Rebecca and Jaden shared a moment, one that would forever change their relationship. It was a moment of recognition, of understanding, and of the kind of love that transcends the mistakes of the past. The healing journey. The courtroom had fallen silent, but not in the way it had before. The tension had shifted, subtly but powerfully. The murmurs that once filled the air with uncertainty had now quieted, replaced by a sense of cautious optimism, a hope that had once seemed impossible. Jaden sat at the defendant's table, his hands now resting on the wood in front of him, no longer clenched into fists. His face was still streaked with tears, but there was a softness in his gaze that hadn't been there before. Rebecca remained kneeling in front of him, her hands still resting gently on his shoulder. A simple gesture, but one filled with all the things she had never been able to say. Until now. She could feel the weight of his emotions, raw and exposed, and she understood in that moment that words alone could never erase the years of absence, the pain or the confusion. But they could begin the healing process. "Jaden," Rebecca whispered, her voice steady but full of emotion. "I don't expect you to forgive me today or even tomorrow, but I want you to know that I am here. I am so sorry for everything that I didn't do. I can't change the past, but I will do whatever it takes to make sure you know you matter to me, now and always." Jaden didn't speak immediately. He didn't need to. His eyes were filled with a mix of disbelief and hope. The boy who had entered that courtroom feeling like a stranger in his own life was slowly, tentatively, beginning to trust again. He was still hurting, and there was still a long way to go, but for the first time in years, Jaden felt something shift inside him. A possibility that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. Rebecca rose to her feet, the weight of her own past pressing down on her with every step, but she didn't let that stop her. She looked out at the courtroom, her gaze sweeping across the faces of the people who had been silently watching. She could feel their eyes on her, but it didn't matter anymore. This was no longer about appearances or maintaining the tough, unshakable persona she had carefully constructed over the years. This was about truth. This was about redemption. For the first time, she spoke directly to the court. "I know that what I've done, what I've failed to do, has affected not just Jaden, but many others. I stand here today, not as a judge, but as a mother who made a choice that I will live with for the rest of my life. I know there is no quick fix for this, no easy way to undo the damage I've caused. But I ask for your understanding as I begin the long process of trying to make things right." The room remained still, the eyes of the spectators fixed on her. In that moment, she felt more vulnerable than she had ever been in her entire career. But it didn't matter. There was something cathartic about shedding the layers of authority and control she had wrapped around herself. For the first time, she was simply Rebecca, a woman who had made a mistake, a woman who wanted to atone, a woman who, despite all her faults, still had the capacity to love. The court remained in silence for a moment longer. And then, as if some unspoken understanding passed through the room, Rebecca's voice broke through again, more resolute this time. "I am requesting that the case against Jaden be dropped. He does not deserve to be punished for a moment of fear and confusion. What he needs, what we both need, is a chance to rebuild. Not just for him, but for myself as well." There was a moment of stunned silence before the bailiff stood up, his voice hesitant as he addressed the court. "Your Honor, the prosecution and defense have agreed to a recess to discuss the specifics of your request." Rebecca nodded, her heart beating in her chest as she turned her attention back to Jaden. His eyes had softened, and there was a tentative smile on his face. It wasn't a smile filled with complete forgiveness, but it was a start. That's all she could hope for right now. Progress, not perfection. As the court adjourned for a short break, Rebecca walked over to Jaden. She stood by his side, not saying anything at first. Her presence, though, was a silent gesture of support, something that spoke volumes more than words ever could. "Do you want to leave with me today?" Rebecca asked gently, her voice steady, but filled with an underlying question. Jaden looked up at her, his eyes still a little wide with the magnitude of everything that had happened. His shoulders tensed, then relaxed as he let out a long breath. I think so," he said quietly, his voice tentative, but with a new hint of hope. "I think I need time. I need to figure out how to trust this, how to trust you. But I want to try. I want to try." Rebecca. Her heart swelled at his words. She didn't expect him to trust her fully right away. How could he? But he was willing to try, and that was enough for now. "I understand, Jaden," she said softly. "And you don't have to make any decisions today. I'm not going anywhere. You have all the time you need." As the court took its brief recess, the tension in the room slowly began to lift. The onlookers, who had been holding their breath throughout the tense standoff, began to murmur amongst themselves. There was no dramatic resolution yet, no fireworks or flashy endings, but something had shifted. The harsh lines between the roles of prosecutor, judge, and defendant had blurred, and for a moment, humanity had taken precedence over the case at hand. Outside the courtroom, a new chapter was beginning for Jaden and Rebecca. The journey ahead would not be without its challenges, but they were no longer bound by the walls of shame, denial, and regret. For the first time, they had been given the chance to be honest with each other. The future was uncertain, but for both of them, it was a future they were now willing to face together. When the break ended, Rebecca and Jaden were called back to the courtroom. The proceedings resumed, but the air in the room had changed. The prosecutor, who had once been adamant about punishing Jaden for his alleged trespassing, seemed more contemplative now. The defense attorney, who had been quiet during the earlier part of the session, stood up with a new sense of purpose. It was clear that something had shifted in the room, a shift that transcended legal jargon and courtroom formalities. Rebecca returned to the bench, taking her seat once more. She cleared her throat, trying to steady herself for what would come next. The prosecutor made his case in a manner far less aggressive than before. The courtroom watched as Jaden's fate hung in the balance. But this time, it wasn't just about the legal charges. It was about something much larger. A boy who had been given a second chance, and a mother who had been granted the opportunity to be present in his life once more. Finally, the decision was made. The case against Jaden was dismissed. The prosecutor's formal statement made it clear that Jaden's future would not be determined by this one mistake. Rebecca's decision to speak the truth had influenced the proceedings in a way no one had expected. For the first time, the system wasn't just about punishment, it was about healing. As the courtroom began to empty, Rebecca stood, her heart still beating with the weight of what had just transpired. She turned to Jaden, who was now standing beside her. His face, though still filled with uncertainty, held something new, a glimmer of trust. "Are you ready to go?" she asked. Jaden nodded. "Yeah, I think I am." And as they walked out of the courtroom together, side by side, it wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something new. They had both faced the hardest truths of their lives. Now they had a chance to rebuild, to face the future, not as mother and son bound by years of absence and regret, but as two people who had found each other again, and who were willing to try, together. The road ahead would be long, but it was theirs to walk. And for the first time, Jaden believed that maybe, just maybe, He could finally have the family he had always dreamed of. The path to redemption. Days passed, and the world outside the courtroom moved on, as it always did. But for Jaden and Rebecca, the world they inhabited was no longer the same. It had been irrevocably altered by a single truth, a truth that had been buried in the shadows for far too long. The road to healing was long, and though they were only just beginning their journey, they both knew that nothing would ever be the same again. For the first time, they were navigating the murky waters of their shared history, both unsure of what lay ahead, but committed to facing it together. Rebecca had never imagined this day would come. For years, she had built her life around a carefully crafted persona, Judge Rebecca Hart, an unshakable pillar of justice, known for her cold professionalism, her ability to separate emotion from duty. She had convinced herself that she had moved on, that her past was something she had outgrown. But when Jaden's words had cracked open the walls she had spent so long erecting, she realized just how much she had buried, how much of herself she had suppressed. And now, as she sat across from Jaden at a small diner, the air heavy with unspoken words, she could feel the gravity of their situation settling on her shoulders. It wasn't a weight that she could escape, and it wasn't something she could fix overnight. But for the first time, she was willing to confront it. Jaden, too, had changed. He no longer seemed like the fragile, lost boy who had entered that courtroom months ago. Though the scars of his past were still etched deep within him, there was a glimmer of something new. Hope, perhaps, or the possibility of something better. He had never expected to see his mother again. In fact, part of him had thought that the search was futile, that the abandonment would forever define his existence. But now, sitting across from Rebecca, a woman he had once believed to be a stranger, he felt a strange sense of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Connection. The diner was quiet except for the clinking of cutlery, the quiet hum of the neon lights overhead. Jaden stared at his plate, pushing the food around absent-mindedly, unsure of how to bridge the gap that still lay between them. He wanted to ask her more questions, about his childhood, about why she had chosen to leave him. But something held him back. The hurt was still there, lingering like a shadow, and he didn't know how to ask without it consuming him. Rebecca noticed his silence and offered him a gentle smile. It was a smile that held the weight of years of regret, but it also held something else. An openness, a willingness to try. "Jaden," she said softly, her voice tentative, "we don't have to talk about everything right now. I know it's a lot to process, but I want you to know I'm here, whenever you're ready." Her words were simple, but they carried more meaning than Jaden could have anticipated. He had expected apologies, explanations, and perhaps even some kind of grand gesture to make up for the years of absence. But instead, Rebecca was offering him the only thing that truly mattered: time. Time to heal, time to understand, and time to choose what their relationship would look like going forward. Jaden met her gaze, the intensity in his eyes making Rebecca's heart tighten. She could see the rawness there, the vulnerability that he had kept hidden for so long. She had never imagined that their first conversation would unfold like this. Quiet, measured, and full of emotion. There was no fanfare, no dramatic reunion, just two people facing the aftermath of years of separation, each trying to navigate the maze of their own feelings. "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel," Jaden admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I spent so many years thinking about you, wondering what happened, why you didn't come back. And now you're here. I don't know what to do with that." Rebecca nodded slowly, understanding more than he could know. "I can't fix what happened, Jaden. I can't erase the years of pain, or the emptiness you must have felt. But what I can do is be here now. I'm not going anywhere. I don't know what the future holds, but I want to be a part of it, whatever that looks like for you." Jaden's eyes flickered with emotion, but he quickly looked away, trying to compose himself. "It's just hard. I thought I would feel different when I saw you again. I thought I would have all these questions, but now that you're here, I just don't know. I'm angry, But I don't want to be. I just want to know what happens next." Rebecca reached across the table, placing her hand gently over his. It was a simple gesture, but in that moment, it felt monumental. "I don't have all the answers, Jaden," she said, her voice filled with a quiet strength. "But we don't have to have everything figured out right now. We'll take it one step at a time. Whatever pace you need, I'll be here." The air between them shifted, a quiet understanding settling between them like a soft blanket. They didn't need to rush. They didn't need to fix everything in one conversation. What they needed was patience from each other and from themselves. The healing would be slow, like the gradual erosion of rock, but it would happen. Over the next few weeks, they continued to meet. At first, their conversations were small, about the weather, about their days, about simple, everyday things. But as time passed, they began to open up more. Rebecca shared pieces of her past, the difficult years that had led her to make the decision to give Jaden up for adoption. Jaden, in turn, spoke more about his childhood, the years spent bouncing between foster homes, the loneliness that had marked so much of his life. Each conversation was like another step forward, and with every word, Rebecca felt the weight of her past grow a little lighter. She wasn't sure if Jaden would ever fully forgive her, or if their relationship could ever be what it should have been all along. But for the first time, she wasn't trying to fix everything at once. She was allowing space for growth, for understanding, for healing. One afternoon, as they sat together in a quiet park, Jaden turned to her, his eyes steady and focused. "I think I get it now," he said softly. "It wasn't easy for you either. I guess I thought you just forgot about me. But I see now that it wasn't like that." Rebecca smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude for his words. "I never forgot about you, Jaden," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. "I just couldn't be what you needed at the time. But I want to try now. I know I can't change the past, but I can show you that I'm here." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the leaves rustle in the breeze, each of them lost in their thoughts. It was a quiet kind of peace, the kind that didn't require grand gestures or dramatic resolutions. It was simply the peace that comes when two people, broken by time and circumstance, begin to rebuild. And so, the days continued, each one bringing a little more healing, a little more understanding. Rebecca knew that the road ahead would not be easy. There would be days when the weight of their past would feel unbearable, days when the questions would resurface, the doubts would creep in. But she also knew that, together, they were starting something new. It wouldn't be perfect, and it wouldn't be easy, but it would be real, and it would be theirs. Jaden and Rebecca were no longer bound by the weight of the past. They had begun to forge a new path, one step at a time, one conversation at a time. And though neither of them knew exactly what the future would hold, they knew one thing for sure. They were no longer alone. They had each other, and that was enough. The road to reconnection. Months had passed since that fateful day in the courtroom when everything had changed. It felt like a lifetime had gone by, yet each day had brought its own set of challenges, revelations, and tiny victories. For Jaden and Rebecca, the journey was no longer about a dramatic reunion or a perfect resolution. It was about something deeper, something more fragile. It was about learning to trust again, not just each other, but themselves. The first few weeks after the courtroom had been a blur. Both of them had retreated into their separate worlds, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. Rebecca had returned to her life as a judge, but she was no longer the woman she had been before. The walls she had built to protect herself from the painful truth of her past had been torn down. It wasn't easy. She had spent years convincing herself that she had made the right decision all those years ago, but now she could no longer ignore the truth. Jaden, too, had retreated into his own space. He had spent so much of his life trying to figure out who he was, trying to make sense of the fractured pieces of his story. He had spent years looking for answers that never came, and now, even though the answers were within reach, it wasn't as simple as just accepting them. He was still hurt, still angry at the years that had been taken from him, still unsure of how to bridge the gap between the boy he had been and the man he was becoming. Yet, with each passing day, they both knew something was changing. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but the pieces were slowly starting to fit together. It started with small moments. A quiet conversation over coffee, where Jaden told Rebecca about a book he was reading, one that helped him understand some of the emotions he had been wrestling with. Then, it was Rebecca sharing stories from her childhood, the ones that weren't in the court records, the ones that had shaped her into the woman she had become. They didn't talk about the past often, but when they did, it was always in a way that made it clear they were finally acknowledging it. They were moving beyond the shame and regret, working towards acceptance and understanding. One afternoon, Jaden and Rebecca sat in a small, peaceful park near the edge of town. It was one of those golden moments in the day when the sun hung low, casting long shadows and soft light over everything. There were no cameras, no reporters, no prying eyes, just the two of them, side by side, breathing in the same air. Jaden leaned against a tree, his fingers brushing the rough bark as he stared out across the horizon. His voice was quiet but strong when he finally spoke. "I used to think that if I ever found you, I'd just want to shout at you, tell you how angry I was, how much I hated you for leaving me. But now that I've actually found you, it's not like that. It's complicated." Rebecca felt the weight of his words sink in. She had known that Jaden had been angry, but hearing it so clearly, so openly, made her heart ache. It wasn't something she had been able to understand at first, the anger that had consumed him. But now, sitting next to him, listening to him, she realized that his anger was part of the process. It was part of the healing. She had robbed him of the chance to know her, to grow up with her. And that was something she would have to live with forever. "I can't change what happened," Rebecca said quietly, her voice heavy with the weight of years of unspoken regret. "I can't go back and undo the mistakes I made. But I want you to know that I'm here now. I'm not perfect, Jaden. I never was. But I want to be here for you in whatever way you need me to be, even if it's just sitting together like this, without words." Jaden didn't respond immediately. He seemed lost in thought, his eyes fixed on the distance. But then, as if coming to some silent decision, he nodded. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you completely," he said, his voice filled with a quiet resolve. "But I think I'm starting to understand you, and that's a start." Rebecca smiled softly, a tear slipping down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but a tear of relief. For the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe again. She didn't expect forgiveness to come quickly, or even at all. But understanding, that was the first step. And understanding meant there was hope for something more, something better than the brokenness they had shared for so long. As they sat in the park, watching the world go by, the reality of their situation slowly began to settle in. They were both still unsure of what the future held, still navigating the complex landscape of their relationship. But what mattered now was that they were here, together, taking small steps toward healing. They didn't need to have all the answers. They didn't need to be perfect. All they needed was time. Time to heal, time to rebuild, and time to learn how to be mother and son. And so, the days passed by in a steady rhythm. Some days were easier than others, but on each one, they found new ways to connect. There were moments when the past felt too heavy to carry, when the pain of separation seemed unbearable. But there were also moments of lightness, of laughter, of genuine connection. These moments were the foundation they were building their relationship on, one small brick at a time. There were setbacks along the way. There were days when Jaden would retreat, when the weight of everything would crash down on him, and he would need space. Rebecca understood those moments. She had learned that love wasn't about always being there with answers. It was about being there, period. It was about showing up when it mattered, even when the answers weren't clear. In the months that followed, Jaden began to open up more. He started talking about his dreams, his goals, things he had kept locked inside for so long. Rebecca encouraged him to pursue what made him happy, to not let his past define him. She could see the spark of ambition in his eyes, a spark that had been dimmed for years, and she was determined to help him nurture it. One evening, as they sat together in Rebecca's living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting gentle light on the room, Jaden spoke up again. "I've been thinking a lot about my future, about what I want to do with my life." Rebecca looked at him, her heart swelling with pride. It was a conversation she never thought she would have with him. "What do you want to do, Jaden?" she asked, her voice filled with warmth. "I don't know yet," Jaden admitted, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. "But I know I want to make something of myself. I don't want to be defined by where I came from, or by the mistakes I've made. I want to be more than that." Rebecca reached over and placed her hand over his. "You already are, Jaden," she said, her voice filled with conviction. "You are more than your past, and whatever you decide to do, I'm here to support you." For the first time, Jaden believed her. He believed in himself too. It wasn't about forgetting the past, it was about accepting it and moving forward. And with Rebecca by his side, he knew he could face whatever came next. They didn't have all the answers yet, and they knew there was still a long way to go. But for the first time in years, they were no longer strangers to each other. They were no longer defined by the mistakes and missteps of their past. They were building something new, something real. And that was enough for now. The road ahead would still be filled with challenges. There would be moments of doubt, of pain, of uncertainty. But they had learned something invaluable. Healing wasn't a destination. It was a journey. And together, they would continue walking that path, one step at a time, side by side. The full circle. As the seasons changed, so did Jaden and Rebecca. Their relationship, once fragmented and buried beneath years of pain, had begun to form into something new, something more enduring. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy. They still had their moments of silence, their awkward pauses, their struggles. But as time passed, they both learned that healing wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about making peace with it and allowing room for growth. One warm evening, months after their first real conversation at the park, Jaden stood in front of a modest audience at his high school graduation. The gymnasium was filled with parents, teachers, and students, all eagerly waiting for the ceremony to begin. Jaden, however, wasn't thinking about the cap and gown he wore, or the speech he was supposed to give. He was thinking about the woman sitting in the audience, Rebecca. As he stood there, waiting for his name to be called, he couldn't help but think about everything that had brought him here. The long, difficult years spent wondering who he was, where he came from, and why he had been left behind. But he had made it. And while the journey had been far from easy, it was his journey, his story. And now, it was one he could tell with pride. Jaden Hart. The announcer's voice rang out, pulling Jaden from his thoughts. His heart raced as he stepped up to the podium, his eyes briefly meeting Rebecca's. There was a softness in her gaze, an approval that reached deep into his chest. It was a look he hadn't expected to receive, but one he was starting to accept. Taking a deep breath, Jaden began his speech. He spoke not just about his accomplishments, but about the lessons he had learned along the way. He talked about the importance of resilience, of finding your way even when the path isn't clear. He spoke about the power of forgiveness, not just forgiving others, but forgiving yourself. And most importantly, he talked about the family he had found, not through blood, but through love and understanding. "I used to think that the things we go through in life define who we are," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But what I've learned is that it's the way we respond to those things that shapes us. It's the people we choose to surround ourselves with, the people who choose us in return, that make us who we are. And for me, that person is sitting right there, my mom." The audience fell silent for a moment, the weight of Jaden's words sinking in. Rebecca sat in the crowd, her hand pressed against her heart, her eyes shining with pride. The journey they had taken together had been long and painful, but in this moment, it felt like everything had come full circle. She had never imagined this day would come, the day when Jaden would not just accept her, but embrace her, flaws and all. And in doing so, he had allowed her to embrace herself as well. When the speech was over, Jaden walked back to his seat, the applause of the crowd ringing in his ears. But all he could hear was the steady beat of his own heart, the warmth of Rebecca's gaze, and the quiet strength they had built together. This was their moment, not just of celebration, but of triumph. In the weeks that followed, Jaden and Rebecca continued to build their relationship, brick by brick. They spent more time together, not in the hurried, chaotic way they once did, but in a peaceful, deliberate way that reflected the growth they had both undergone. There were still hard days, still times when old wounds would resurface, but they had learned to navigate those moments with patience, understanding, and most importantly, honesty. Jaden began to thrive, pursuing his education with a passion he had never known. He found a new sense of purpose, a direction that was his own, and he made choices that were his own, free from the weight of his past. Rebecca supported him, not as an authority figure or as a judge, but as a mother, one who had learned that love wasn't about control. It was about giving someone the freedom to become who they were meant to be. And so, the story of Jaden and Rebecca continued, no longer defined by abandonment or regret, but by the power of second chances. They had both learned the importance of facing the past without letting it define the future. They had learned that the path to healing wasn't a straight line, but a winding road filled with detours, setbacks, and moments of incredible beauty. There would always be more to learn, more to understand, but for the first time, they were walking that road together. The lesson was clear. We all carry the weight of our pasts, but it's how we choose to carry them, and who we choose to carry them with, that determines who we become. And for Jaden and Rebecca, that meant choosing to walk through life side by side, embracing the imperfect journey of healing, one step at a time. In the end, the greatest gift they had given each other wasn't just forgiveness. It was the willingness to try, again and again, to build something real. And that, they both knew, was worth everything. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.